wasn't here. Although it wasn't at 9 a.m. in the morning, it was in the evening, and then it turned into an actual party. It's a very similar type of setup, and the talks went, and then they had this thing out there, and it was, some of the better things I've been to in a very long time. So when I heard it was being held here, I was like, great, that's a lot of time. And I was like, ooh, different vibe.
Ready to start? Okay. Welcome, everybody. This event is part of the Melbourne Conversations event series run by City of Melbourne. We'll be taking questions at the end of the event. For our in-person audience, thank you everybody who turned up on this chilly Thursday morning. You'll have an opportunity to ask us questions at the end. If you are watching us online, you can submit your questions in the Slido, which is right next to the YouTube stream, or you can submit them to conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au. If you're watching at home, you can also subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversations. I'd like to start by acknowledging country. The City of Melbourne respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land, the Bunurong, Boon Wurrung, and Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. We are committed to our reconciliation journey because at its heart, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples for the benefit of all Victorians. With the rise of cryptocurrencies and NFTs and the avoidance of using cash during COVID due to hygiene concerns, has the shift to a cashless economy moved one step closer? If cash was a thing of the past, how would our lives and economies be impacted, and would this be a change for the better? I'm Laura Summers, and joining me today to discuss this are David Tennant to my left and Dr. Prash P to my right. We're going to start by inviting them both to just hop up and give us a quick little position statement, a conversation starter to give a sense of who they are and what their background is and how they come to this conversation. Dr. Prash is the CEO of Caleb & Brown, Australia's first dedicated cryptocurrency brokerage. A medical doctor by training, Dr. Prash first became interested in cryptocurrencies via his libertarian roots. He started Caleb & Brown to bridge a gap in the market, the lack of a trusted, well-supported, and secure on-ramp to allow investors large volume access to the crypto market in a manner more akin to traditional financial services, and was voted Young Executive of the Year by Australian-wide Indian Executive Council in 2018. Dr. Prash, would you like to start by giving a little intro into your thoughts on this space? About cashless economies, yes.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. So I was posed this question about a cashless economy and what the future would look like and what spending would look like in 30 years' time. I'm glad I had a bit of time to think about this one because it's a nice, broad question. Got a couple of points to perhaps outline. First is sort of in the title of this entire session, but the idea of cash or paper money, the idea of little slips of paper that we walk around and hold in our wallets, that is not even to mention coins jingling around in our pockets, is starting to sound as archaic a system as the idea of lugging your goats around to exchange for a block of cheese. And I dare say most of us are in relative agreement on that one. So it's a moot point we can probably move on from pretty quickly. A second point I'd like to bring up in terms of where spending would be like, what spending would look like in 30 years' time, would be the rise of digital currencies. And I'd be quite keen to make a key delineation between digital currencies and cryptocurrencies as being very sort of paradigmically quite different. Digital currencies, principally central bank digital currencies, are quite different in that they're still centralized and still issued by central banks, governmental agencies. And in effect, it's not going to be that different from a digitized version of cash. In effect, most of us operate now in terms of using PayPass and our credit cards. Central bank digital currencies, which will aim to completely replace cash and be the only sort of the sole modus operandi of all financial systems, are likely to be the future. And we certainly have several countries, China particularly, leading the way in terms of onboarding this. What's going to be key in all this, in my mind, is a far more seamless, borderless, transactional economy where there's far greater transparency to foreign exchange transactions than the opacity that the banking system currently creates, which will allow us to be able to trade internationally and with foreign currencies far easier than we do now, as well as the establishment of a secondary market for the trade and transfer of these currencies, which will be far more liquid than what the retail investor currently has access to. And I think that will be a very distinct shift in the way the global economy operates, or at least for the retail investor to be able to access the global economy in a way that only the institutional investor currently can. The third point I'd like to outline is the role of cryptocurrencies in the future. Now, this is obviously my little soapbox, so please excuse me for spending a bit of time on this one. But I am not going to be that optimistic as to say that cryptocurrencies are going to be the future. But I think it would be foolish not to accept that they're going to be a large part of the future. And one key difference, again, that I'd like to outline is the difference between a cryptocurrency and a digital currency, or cryptocurrency and money as we know it now, is that money as we know it now is a very simple thing, just a transfer of value that is asked to do very, very complex things. And in so doing, it requires a very complex and complicated application layer to be built around it, so that this very simple protocol layer can execute on very complex functions. That involves banks, that involves complex financial services, that involves intermediaries, escrows, lawyers, trust accounts, very complex application layers. Cryptocurrencies are cardinally different in that each cryptocurrency is a technology in its own right. And this is, I guess, something that isn't very clear to many people. It is not just a store of value. It is not just money. It is money and technology built into one and the same. And in that provides a far more complex protocol layer in itself, which allows the surrounding application layer to be far more simple. So you now have a very complex center, which can do very complicated things in its own right, which allows you to have far simpler things around it. This idea of the Internet of Things is another one of those buzzwords that's been talked about quite a bit recently, where your fridge is connected to your vacuum cleaner, which is connected to your light switches. This idea that your fridge can order milk the moment your milk is starting to run low. We laugh, but it's exactly what we're building towards. A friend of mine bought a $10,000 fridge recently, and I was like, dude, but does it cook your own food? But he's like, no, because it's going to be connected to the internet. And so that's the direction in which we are heading. But consider that reality if we're still operating with cash. That reality is not going to be feasible, it's not going to be able to be powered without a complex protocol layer that allows things like smart contracts, money that pays itself. And that's where cryptocurrencies really come into the fore in terms of powering the vision of the future that we are starting to imagine in various other technological fields. And I do envision a world where, if you'll sort of excuse me, this utopian ideal where you hold Bitcoin as your personal bank account and your personal store of value, which you then convert into Ethereum, for example, for any of your business applications that you need to write up on smart contracts, that you can then also seamlessly convert into something like Stellar or Litecoin, which has low transaction fees and fast transaction speeds that you use to pay for your coffees or use for your daily transaction. And this completely seamless economy that is able to be transferred from one to the other is how, I guess, the cryptocurrency utopian, and a lot of us in the industry, sees cryptocurrency influencing spending going forward. I think you can probably stop there for now.
Oh, that was great. Thank you, Dr. Prash. Certainly, I'm very curious about why we don't see more point of sales happening for cryptocurrencies, like accepting multiple currency types. Maybe that's something we can touch on later. I'll introduce David now. David Tennant has been the CEO and regional community service provider of Family Care since May 2010. Family Care is the main provider of child and family services across the Goulburn Valley and has its headquarters in Shepparton. David is a lawyer who has worked in community services sector for over 25 years, focusing on issues impacting the lives of low-income and disadvantaged people. He holds a variety of representative roles and is a previous chair of both the Consumers Federation of Australia and Financial Counselling Australia. Thanks for being here, David, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the matter.
Thanks, Laura, and yes, I'm very grateful to be here, and slightly terrified because it's the first time I've been back to Melbourne in over a year, and I wasn't confident I could find it again, but fortunately it hadn't moved since the last time I'd been here. And thank you, Prash, because the issues that you raise are not often ones that we get the luxury of thinking about in our sector, but they will be absolutely critical to the people that we work with. And I guess that's a good launching pad to say my soapbox, if you like, or the issues that I'm most concerned about are those things that impact low-income people and often people who are reliant on some form of government benefit to survive. And the reality for those people is that they don't drive markets. Their ability to be able to influence and shape the products and services that are available to them is minimal. Frequently, they get what they're given and told this is what you must put up with. To the extent that there are advantages for those people, they are often long fought for. And so, as Laura said in that introduction, I've been doing this stuff now for over 25 years, and when I entered the sector, we were having arguments with the financial services industry about the safety and affordability of savings accounts. You know, just really basic things so that people would be able to get a bank account that didn't charge transaction fees for doing basic things like getting a balance on their account, or making small value transactions that would totally consume their benefit income before the time that the next benefit would be paid. There was even a Prices Surveillance Authority inquiry into saying, how come it is that banks are consuming so much of our savings to pay themselves for doing really basic things that are actually what are meant to be the key features of the services they're offering. And surprise, surprise, the people who were high value customers weren't paying those fees. They were predominantly weighted toward the low to moderate income end of the consumer market. So those arguments over time have largely been won, and they've largely had, albeit late and sometimes begrudging, support from industry to get to a point where there is a great deal more fairness and democracy in consumer markets. And yet here we are, poised on the edge of this revolution of how we're going to transact in the future, and yet again, low-income people are, sort of wondering how they engage with that revolution. And sadly, the first steps in the process don't look great, because the things that are now being designed in the emerging cashless economy for low-income people are not those things that give them a new sense of power and liberty. They're in fact taking away those liberties. And the worst of those things are the control of benefit incomes through mandatory cashless transaction schemes, things like income management and the cashless debit card. The town that I live and work in, Shepparton, is the only place in Victoria that has a form of cashless income management. And I have stood behind people in the queue at a supermarket and seen them pull out this card that identifies them as being a low-income person who is not capable of managing their own money. And, there is a sense of almost palpable shame as they present that card and identify themselves in that way. And Laura, at the start, you acknowledged the traditional owners. You noted that Melbourne Knowledge Week is, like many organisations, committed to the idea of reconciliation. And yet the predominant people in this country who are required so far to transact in that manner are Aboriginal people. And indeed, across the trial sites for these types of mechanisms, the overwhelming majority of people who are required to comply are Aboriginal people. So for me, those are regressions in policy, and rather than actually thinking about ways that we might inform, engage and empower low-income people, we're taking them back 20 or 30 years.
It certainly smacks of paternalism for me. The idea that there are different levels to engage in the economy, or that you would have to have your spending controlled by a higher power, certainly feels like a disempowering force as opposed to one that, helps people find their agency, find their way back to, more financial security. As you were talking, it occurred to me that one of the things that is often true for lower income people and disadvantaged people is they don't necessarily have full-time jobs where their super and their tax is paid by their employer. And it occurs to me to ask, perhaps it could be an alternate vision of a digital currency is one in which people who are working, like part-time or casual jobs have those mechanisms baked in regardless. Like, is there something where a government could have a transactional layer, which is if we were getting paid through a digital currency, it was saying, we're just going to do the job of taking out your tax and investing in super for you, and we're going to do this and make it explicit we're doing it, but also this is a way to reduce some of your paperwork and make this a bit easier for you. Is that maybe a positive future we could imagine for a digital currency, which is less punitive to lower income people?
If I think about some of the things that you've just described as outcomes rather than steps to get to those outcomes, then I'd absolutely agree. If you've got people engaged with their own financial capacity, planning for their future, being thoughtful about how they use their resources now, then all of those things are really good. They're part of a conversation around financial literacy, around what financial well-being means to you as an individual. And well-being is not all about the level of income you've got, but your ability to make your own choices and chart your own course. So the next part of the proposition, which is the government might provide those steps for you, is where I probably would part company with the idea that that's a good idea. I think governments traditionally are not very good at saying to people, here's where we want you to get to, and here's the steps that we've designed for you to get there. Invariably, the best and most sustainable outcomes are where people get to make informed choices, and they then get to follow those choices through. And it doesn't mean that they always do it the right way. Sometimes it's about learning because you did something in a particular manner, it didn't give you the best outcome, so you try again. Those are choices that we ought to be encouraging even school children to do. And I worry that we are automatically leaping to conversations about highly complex instruments where what we need to do is perhaps empower our young people to be thinking about value in a different way, and money as a concept in a different way, and giving them tools so that they can make sensible choices rather than telling them to do things and punishing them if they don't do it.
If I can just add briefly to that, I think society has a track record of realizing that control is far easier, cheaper, and more effective for the top down than education. And that has been true in many different areas, everything from drug law reform to healthcare policy to monetary policy. And the end outcome every single time has been worse off for those at the bottom of the pyramid. and anything that leads us towards greater control as the answer, as opposed to greater education, has a dystopian reality as a very looming shadow behind it.
So what I'm hearing is we want to provide the tools but not make them mandatory. If you've just joined us online, my name is Laura Summers, and we're listening to Dr. Prash and David Tennant. We're watching Melbourne Conversations, What Comes After Cash, as part of the Melbourne Conversations event series run by the City of Melbourne. Just as a reminder for the in-person audience, you do have a chance to ask questions in a little bit, so start thinking about what you want to talk to us about. And if you are watching online, you do have the opportunity to submit questions through the Slido, which is immediately there next to the streaming video, or you can send it to conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au. I think this could be an interesting point to segue into the sort of primary difference between fiat currency, which is regulated by the government, and cryptocurrency. And Dr. Prash, I might just sort of throw to you just for people who may not be familiar, like we often talk about cryptocurrency as the blockchain and, like these deep technologies, but there is a sort of fundamental break with the idea of currency as it stands. And I think it might be worth explaining that for our audience.
Okay. Let's explain cryptocurrency in 2.5 minutes. I'll just focus on that one basic key tenet, I think. Ideologically key to the cryptocurrency movement is the idea of decentralization, which is taking power away from centralized points of control and authority and returning them to the using populace, which is why one of the key mechanisms in any cryptocurrency ecosystem is that of voting via the populace, voting with your money, and a 51% vote essentially being required for any change in monetary policy, for example. Conversely, in currency as we know it, there are always centralized points of control. And that leads to two outcomes. One, there's a centralized point of potential adulteration and corruption. Without getting too sort of conspiratorial about it, I think that is a reality that all of us have had to accept and understand with every major financial disaster or collapse which has resulted in no change. Secondly, it also leads to a central point of failure. And that is one key difference that the cryptocurrency ecosystem is trying to change. Without a central point of control, there isn't that central point of failure. It means that you have a distribution of risk and you have a distribution of authority, control, and governance, and that is distributed among the using populace. And that democratization of money is important more than just in terms of its function. It's important because money seeps into all of our lives, and the way money is structured ideologically starts to affect the way we see the world and the way we see society and the way we operate in society. And if democratization, if a philosophy is steeped so sort of primordially into the money we operate in, the end effects in terms of how it starts to affect society and how we operate in society are going to be undeniable. And that's probably the without talking about crypto for half an hour, that's the key difference that I would like to put across in terms of end outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for that. The idea of centralization of power and control versus the decentralization, I think, is key. And it's easy for that to kind of get swept under the rug and all of the other things to discuss with crypto. One other thing that came up for me, I was thinking about the idea that at the moment, I'm sure everyone knows we have record low interest rates. We have had governments around the world doing like hard pushes on quantitative easing. One interesting variable to consider is that many cryptocurrencies do this hard cap on the amount of currency that's like able to be created. And I welcome either of you to sort of speak to how that might impact us economically if we were living in a world where we had cryptocurrencies with fixed caps, would that be better or worse? Would that sort of get us out of this like pushing our foot down on the gas but not going any faster situation we find ourselves in right now? And I've just like come up with this off the top of my head, so I'm throwing this to the speakers with no prep, but they're both very smart.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in here. Yeah. Bitcoin is a perfect example of this. Sort of written into the cryptographic code of the technology that drives Bitcoin is a limited cap of Bitcoin. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin that will ever exist, and that sits at complete opposition to our current financial policy, which basically sounds like turn the money printer on.
Money printer goes brr.
Money printer goes brr. And it's been going brr for a very, very long time, and it continues to do so. And in so doing, creates a consistently inflationary monetary and financial landscape. And constantly inflationary monetary landscape of which, again, the top of the pyramid still benefits the most, that the effects of that inflation are most felt at that bottom of the pyramid, where the most disadvantaged cop the after effects. The crypto ecosystem, certainly the Bitcoin ecosystem, it turns that completely on its head, in that it is a completely deflationary ecosystem. As the ecosystem grows, each Bitcoin ends up being worth more and more and more, because there will only ever be that much Bitcoin, and the more money is being put into that ecosystem, the more that Bitcoin is worth. And skeptics of this sort of point to how this just would cause current financial and monetary policy to fail, and how that is a reason why Bitcoin is just not a sustainable model. Well, the question I pose is that a problem with Bitcoin, or is that a problem with current financial policy? Any future technology, and this is the case of not just Bitcoin, but everything from the time we first had cars trying to drive on roads that were made for horse-drawn carriages, any future technology that you try to fit into present-day paradigms will fail. It absolutely will fail. That is the process of transition. That is the process of progress. The only way to judge that future technology is to consider what your version of the future looks like, what you could possibly imagine your version of the future looks like, and how this future technology potentially fits into that version of the future. And that may require dismantling all these known and accepted structures of the present. And I think current financial policy does fit into that category of something that does need dismantling to an extent. Whether that will happen is a completely different story. Whether the vested interests and powers that maintain that ecosystem and status quo will allow that to happen, completely different story, but one can dream.
Prash, I know that I'm on dangerous ground here. I've got 2 teenage daughters, and when they saw what the subject was today, they laughed a little and said, "For God's sake, Dad, don't say anything about electronic stuff, as if you know what you're talking about," when they have to show me how to use my mobile phone every night. But I think your comments around the fitness for purpose of our regulatory system and approach are the ones that resonate most with me. And we have traditionally regulated around consumer protection, whether it's in financial services or anything, on the basis of regulating process. Like steps of, this is how you'll contract, this is what you'll give to people to disclose information. Maybe we can't do that anymore, or maybe we ought to be brave enough about contemplating a different way of regulating that's based around principles and outcomes. What is it that we see as success in an outcome? And, there's an encouraging discussion in the regulatory community at the moment about fairness. And if we reframe our regulatory system around fairness instead of rules, then we might find we can open ourselves up to that sort of conversation.
I'm wondering, just so that we don't sound like we're too bullish on crypto, I'm wondering what are the challenges both with crypto and with digital currencies more broadly with the loss of anonymity? When transactions always have your name and your identity printed on them, printed either on the blockchain ledger or on some like log somewhere on a server. Like, if we lose anonymity as part of our capacity to engage in the economy, what does that mean?
Yeah. In the area with which I'm most familiar, which is the increasing intrusion into the lives of benefit recipients and using electronic control, that's a real problem. And you're right, cash is anonymous. There are disadvantages, you lose your cash in your wallet and it's absolutely gone, whereas there are some forms of electronic protection. But not just the ability, but the stated intention to use some of those tools to monitor how and where people spend, to design the tools to prevent people making particular types of purchases, segmenting out part of our consumer population into those who are sufficiently worthy to make those choices themselves, and those, because they receive some sort of benefit from the state, are no longer worthy and therefore must be managed and controlled. That says to me we're rapidly moving toward a banking underclass. That's a really bad outcome. And I was reading just last night some reports of people who have been subject to those trials of cashless debit. And you can, if you are one of the mandatory participants, request to be removed from the program by showing that you are sufficiently capable with money to be able to be removed. And the experiences of a single mum describing how to make that request she had to write to a committee of peers in her community describing why she was sufficiently capable. So expose herself and her personal information to people she might pass walking down the street to have them make that decision as to her capacity. But on top of that, government was able to review information about her transacting history, up to and including looking at her savings accounts and her statements. And one of the reasons provided for rejecting her requests was that there had been a number of transactions declined. And the irony in all of it was that the transactions were declined because the system wasn't working properly. So when she presented the card, it didn't work. So, we have these incredibly regulated and detailed systems that are about saying, unless you are a person that we deem to be worthy, then privacy doesn't matter to you anymore. We can intrude into your life and have access to all of that information all of the time. To me, that's fundamentally wrong.
I'm reminded of an apocryphal story about Donald Trump, who apparently was walking with his daughter and walked past a homeless person on the street and said, "Look, Tiffany, I have more debt than that guy, but I'm me and he's him," or something to that effect. And I think that that speaks strongly to this sort of two-tier banking system you're describing, David. That's horrifying, the idea that the system itself caused the issues, which were then perceived as financial, immaturity. Did you want to speak to anonymity as well?
Not as much. I think we've talked about anonymity quite a bit, but to add to that, the lack of security around your own data is one thing. Perhaps even more insidious is then the capacity to be completely locked out of the financial system, which is an irreversible and terrifying outcome, which is already reality in some places. China has really led the way with central bank digital currencies and its imagination of the digital yuan. And China, by virtue of already having WeChat, WePay, social credit scoring, all built into one completely amalgamated system, is starting to see the possibility to, at the switch of the flick of a switch, be able to completely lock someone out of the financial system and the social system in one fell swoop. And that is absolutely terrifying. And that is what something like a central bank, a digital currency, allows one to do. And it is the future that it is moving towards. this is, again, the irony of people talking about digital currency and cryptocurrency in the same breath, is that what cryptocurrency aims to do is the exact, complete opposite of that. It aims for complete anonymity. There's one of the new buzz phrases in global finance now is this idea of open banking. Complete transparency within banking systems, which I sit and laugh at. The fact that in 2020 we now have to have a word called open banking, when for most of society who weren't financially literate probably assumed that that was supposed to be the status quo. Now we need to have a word for it. Anyway, but the tagline for open banking and greater financial inclusion is this idea of, there are 1.3 billion unbanked globally, and we need to bank the unbanked. Whereas in the Bitcoin economy, the tagline consistently is to unbank the banked. And that's not just some little kitsch little line, but that is truly what it is, to remove yourself from the banking system, and in so doing, remove yourself from being under the purview and potentially lockout of centralized powers. Again, this is all starting to sound very conspiratorial, but let me make it very clear that, at least for someone like me, I don't have a problem with regulation or the need for governance. I think that's essential for a society or a framework to move forward. But I'd like to draw a very clear line between the need for governance and the power given to government. And when you start to talk about true democracy, yes, governance is necessary, but the completely skewed weight of power that government has doesn't really sit well with me with the idea of true democracy. And that's the dangerous reality that digital currencies can create, if not modulated very, very carefully.
Yeah, it makes me think of Sandra Bullock in The Net, and oh, my identity is gone and I can't access any systems. And if we are in a fully digital currency world, like where they're going with digital yuan, that certainly seems like, well, and especially given that China has attached many of these systems to their social credit system, which then can impact people's ability to travel or access certain kinds of services. It's scary to think about our capacity to move in the world or engage in, various kinds of economies being like both visible and easily constrictable by government power. Just a reminder that we are going to have questions in just a few minutes, but I'm just going to bring up a couple more comments and hopefully get your juices flowing. I do want to talk a little bit critically about crypto, and specifically there have been some visible concerns with people investing in cryptocurrencies, not understanding what they're doing, possibly getting burnt. And while I'm very interested in the sort of long vision of what cryptocurrency could be like in the short term right now, it really feels like it's only an investment engine. It really feels like that's where we're at. And I'm interested to hear from either of you if you have thoughts on how we can protect people from engaging in this investment market in a way that's, if they don't understand it, or if they're like vulnerable to, sort of the scammier edges of the ecosystem, how we might protect people, how we might help them like understand what it is they're engaging with, so that they don't fall vulnerable and, possibly lose their savings or lose a significant portion of their income by accident, essentially, because it's certainly it's been visibly problematic, and I think. Hopefully this is just the stage of immaturity of the technology, and we'll see this sort of problem fade away. But would either of you like to speak to the challenges of helping, especially older people who might be less familiar with these technologies, understand what's appropriate in terms of engaging in the investment ecosystem?
Given the limited amount of value I'm likely to add to the answer, I might go first so that Prash can say something sensible afterwards. But you've described it as being an immature state at the moment, and therefore there are risks associated in being, both an early adopter and somebody who would pursue a course with an emerging market. That's probably not going to suit most of the clients that come to an agency like Family Care, and probably not for a considerable period of time. But history tells us that there are lots and lots of examples of where, you know, emerging ideas to encourage people to take a punt have sought to take advantage of low-income people. Not in things as, you know, shiny and flash as, say, cryptocurrency, but, you know, timeshare arrangements where we were selling people opportunities to share in holiday dreams that they couldn't ever access and in some instances didn't even exist. You know, pawning arrangements that use gold or the perception of gold as being available as a trading item. You know, just nonsense stuff that now, with the benefit of hindsight, you look back at and think, how could anybody have thought that was fair or appropriate? But it happened, and it preyed on low-income people. So I think we need to make sure that if we are going to build this appropriate system of regulation and governance, and you know, whether it's the model that Prash has been talking about or some other version thereof, we have to get some of that in place before we allow it to be launched on people who can't afford to lose those resources.
Okay. Probably three key angles in which to tackle this. The first is that the likelihood of scams with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin is high, and certainly has been demonstrated to be historically very prevalent. And that is because in a lot of ways, particularly in its nascent stages where KYC or know your customer regulations were not, you know, put in place or enforced by regulators, crypto and Bitcoin was a great anonymous way for scamsters to fleece people out of money, and in a way that was then going to be untraceable. That is starting to recede by virtue of the fact that regulators have started to enforce very strict controls around identity provision, and enforcing these at the level of the digital currency exchange providers, such as a brokerage like I run. But yes, the scams have definitely been an issue. I would like to think that is not as much a problem with the technology or the ideology behind it, but as much a problem with humans, and humans utilizing that technology, seeing the opportunity. And if you look at every nascent technology, the first people to use it have been criminals. This was exactly true of the internet. For example, when the internet first came up, everyone was terrified that it was going to be used by pornographers and terrorists and child sex traffickers. And yeah, it was, but now it's mostly used to exchange, you know, cat videos. It's the natural progression of technology. Criminals are going to use the technology first. If anything, you should look at what criminals are doing, because they're the ones who are trying to circumvent current processes. That should give you a pretty good insight as to what the next cutting edge is going to be. Not trying to defend crypto here. Let's be very sorry.
I just love that your hot take is like criminals, the real innovators. It's like amazing.
Well, necessity is the mother of all invention. But anyway, I'm not necessarily trying to spin it, or maybe I am. But the scams are real. The humans are the problem. Let us not necessarily confuse the ideology or the technology. The second thing, again, sort of in defense of the technology, is hacks. And Bitcoin has almost become synonymous with hacks. In fact, I gave a talk about it 6 months or a year ago, in which I had actually taken the effort to sort of count all the different hacks. I think we were at about 123 different major hacks that extended from anywhere from a couple of million to a couple of 100 million. One key thing to note here is that the blockchain ledger, the actual Bitcoin ledger, Bitcoin itself has never been hacked. The infrastructure around it has been hacked 123 times, probably 133 by now. 34. 35. That seems to be the rate. But that is, again, testament to the nascency of the ecosystem. This is a really young ecosystem with very immature infrastructure, which has developed with zero top-down support, full top-down resistance from some of the most powerful powers that could be global finance, global banking, global government. And it has emerged completely from the bottom up. It's been a sort of developers in hoodies in basements driven industry that has gotten to this point. The fact that that infrastructure is immature and has potential to be hacked should not be a surprise. It should almost be accepted. That doesn't mean it should be excused, and that greater protections shouldn't be in place to ensure that that doesn't continue to happen. It's one of the reasons why Caleb and Brown, which is the company I founded, was started in the way it was, which was to provide, and this is not a shameless plug, I absolutely promise you, although if you take it as such, I will not complain. But it was to provide a personalized brokerage service such that there was as a person on the phone that you could speak to who was your broker, who would be able to manage all of this for you, so you didn't accidentally do something that you would then regret and that you could not reverse in the future. That is just one example of the kind of protections that could be put out there. And exchanges, particularly the global exchanges, are doing huge amounts now to ensure the greater safety and security of their systems. But anyway, I've sort of rambled on in defense of crypto. But essentially, yes, the dangers are there. The dangers are very prevalent. And it's the human element that we still need to guard very carefully around.
Scammer's going to scam. Yeah, that's fair. I would just like to open up to the audience if there are any questions. I don't have any coming through Slido yet, but I would love to hear from the audience if anyone has any questions. Just raise your hand. Will is going to come around. He's got a mic, or there's, he's...
So towards the start of the talk, there was the idea of crypto being a complex tool surrounded by simple systems. And even putting the application or the technology to aside, it seems like there is a fundamental level of complexity, and whether that's the liquidity, which adds to some potential variability in the markets, or just even understanding how this new transaction works. When we look at the lower socioeconomical people, there's a problem there, not that they don't have the capacity to understand these things, but certainly they have less of a buffer in their income, and the idea of planning becomes such more of an essential part of their life. Do you have any thoughts on how there could be a bridge between these two worlds?
It's a criticism that has been leveled against cryptocurrency that, on one hand, you say you're all about the people and greater democratization and returning power to the people, and yet what you end up creating is this really complex system that most people can't understand, firstly, let alone try to engage in. And is that not only creating just a different kind of divide from what we already have now? Unfortunately, I don't actually have an answer to that one, and I do agree that it is perpetuating a different kind of divide. I am somewhat reassured in that the divide it is creating, at least ideologically, doesn't skew towards powers of control, but it skews towards knowledge base. What I would like to see, and certainly something that we're doing as a company, and I know some of the big exchanges, for example, are starting to do, is to invest greater and greater amounts of money in terms of corporate social responsibility by way of greater education. So one of the major exchanges is now starting to fund education programs for cryptocurrency in schools. And that is facing major challenge because there's the huge obstacle they're coming against is the education board not necessarily wanting to allow that yet, because that is not their idea of what financial literacy looks like. But that's just one example of ways in which that divide could be bridged. But as it stands now, I completely stand with you that there is a potential danger there of one large gap just transferring to another type of large gap. Absolutely.
I think from low-income perspective, the conundrum you've described is a difference between learning concepts around good money management and becoming a calm and informed investor. And for most low to moderate income people, money management is far more important. it's important for everybody, but it's especially important for them because they don't have the capacity to make mistakes and recover easily from them. But I would make the point that, after doing this stuff for a very, very long period of time, the assumptions around low-income people being poor money managers are usually wrong. In fact, they're invariably the best money managers because they have to be.
I'll just throw in my 2 cents, my personal agenda, which is this says to me even more strongly that learning basic programming skills and learning how to engage with technologies needs to be a form of literacy. It needs to be part of our education from, like first year all the way through to uni. And you don't have to turn into a programmer to have basic understanding of computer logic and programming skills, and that would feed into having a better capacity to grapple with cryptocurrency as a concept, and it would feed into having better financial literacy. It would make us better thinkers. I just think we all should be programmers, at least at some level. But that's my little drum. Would anyone else in the audience like to ask our wonderful speakers some questions? I think.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. So I just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on how cryptocurrency, if you think, is dominating the market and how it's influencing the central banking system?
I think the question was how cryptocurrency is dominating the market and impacting the central banking system. Is that correct? Yeah.
I wish cryptocurrency was dominating the system. I really do. The total market cap of cryptocurrencies right now is $2 trillion. The market capital of Bitcoin is $1 trillion. That is a toenail on the greater body of finance. The market capital of gold alone is, I think it's now up to about $10 or $11 trillion, let alone global equities. I think that's about 70 trillion. Global real estate's about 200 trillion. It most certainly isn't, unfortunately, dominating sort of the global financial system. It is dominating the news now, and that is purely because of sort of speculative gains that are being made by a lot of people. It is dominating the news, but it's not dominating global finance, and it's certainly not influencing central monetary policy at this point. Perhaps once it gets to a certain scale, it will start to, and the greater institutional involvement that we see into Bitcoin, and typically I look at Tesla putting $1.5 billion onto their balance sheet, or $1.5 billion of Bitcoin to the balance sheet. Michael Saylor and his move to get major institutional investors into cryptocurrency, that will start to cause central monetary policy to sort of sit up, take notice, and address this. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening for a few years. I'd like to be very happy to stand corrected on that one. And once we get to a certain size, I think there will be a shift that it will create just out of mass effect. But we most certainly are not there yet.
Just a reminder that machine learning was invented in the 70s and only really came into its fore in the 2010s. So sometimes there's a gap between when a technology is technically feasible and when it really starts to hit the market and scale up in that traditional sense. Were there other questions? I thought I saw a hand over here. Also, a reminder for those online that you can pop in a question in the Slido next to the video. Would love to hear from you online as well.
So this is something I was thinking about during lockdown and the increased digitization and lack of money transactions. And I was thinking about the sort of less palatable, seedy underworld of trade in drugs and other illegal activities. I feel like maybe there has to be a shift societal to actually think about those things, and we don't, because drug use is still a thing, but it's still illegal. How do you think that kind of world is going to adapt in an increased digitized society where cash is no longer able to be traded? Do you think people will trade in other ways? Do you think we'll have a new barter system? It feels like there's going to be a second layer that is sort of hidden, and people are going to be increasingly disempowered because they won't be able to trade with money as such. And again, their movements and transactions would either need to be, they're going to have to be accepted somehow, especially people with addiction or something like that. Like, how is that going to work?
I'm hearing the idea of like a dark money version instead of the dark web. There's the dark money layer. David, I saw you nodding your head. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, one of the key reasons the government used for launching cashless debit for benefit recipients was to prevent the purchase of things the government didn't want people to spend money on. So, drugs, alcohol, gambling, all things that in the policy statements were intended to make sure that income provided by the Commonwealth was spent on things that had regard to people's well-being, and particularly for the care of children. Laudable goals, but when you're talking about complex issues like addiction, they make almost no difference at all. And by having a blunt instrument that says all people will only, in this category, will only be able to transact using this facility in this way, then you sweep into the conversation a whole bunch of people who don't have those problems. If you want to tackle those types of issues, the use of illegal substances, problems like addiction, then you need to invest in the services and supports that actually tackle those issues and not try to do it in a circuitous route that actually doesn't work.
Okay, my brain's exploding on this one on two fronts, because as a doctor, everything I've worked in, or most of what I worked in and operated in, was in drug law reform and drug harms and addiction. Firstly, digital currencies and cryptocurrencies, together with what we've already spoken about in terms of having KYC, know your customer regulations in place such that they become eminently trackable. Conversely to what the stigmatized notion of cryptocurrencies are, which is that, they're completely anonymous and you can hide away and it's used for money laundering. No, you know what's used for money laundering? Money. That's what's used for money laundering, and it probably always will be. That's why it's attempting to be removed. Conversely, it actually makes this incredibly difficult because all transactions now become completely transparent. And so those who are trying to circumvent that letter of the law find themselves either needing to, there's a dark net and a darker net. And within the crypto ecosystem, there are what we call privacy coins, things like Zcash and Monero, which are completely opaque privacy coins, and these have come under the greatest scrutiny by regulators, and most digital currency exchanges will not trade in them for that purpose. For criminals who want to continue to operate using cryptocurrencies, they will still be able to, as long as they never leave that cryptocurrency to fiat currency interface. And someone brought up this idea of like, if Al-Qaeda was taking funding in Bitcoin, I'm like, yeah, sure. But if Al-Qaeda was taking funding in Bitcoin and then transferring that to the various other mujahideen just in Bitcoin, and you had this entire Bitcoin economy going on in the deserts of Afghanistan, man, I will be so impressed, firstly. But also the likelihood of that happening, without being able to make that exchange into fiat, makes that quite hard, quite difficult to happen. And so I do think that the greater digitization will see that curbed in a lot of ways. And yes, criminal activity will need to find other ways to get by. And which means me to a second point, which is that criminal activity will always happen. We're humans. And drug addiction, drug use, for example, is one of those inalienable truths of human life. Taxes will rise. We want to get high. It's always been the case. And we have tried to illegalize drug use in the past. There was this thing called prohibition, and not that long ago, if you remember it. And we made alcohol illegal, and then we realized, oh, wait, no, actually, we all just want to get high. So what did we do? We regulated it. We tried to educate people better on it, but you shouldn't be putting brandy in your kids' milk to get them to sleep. That was education. That was risk minimization and harm reduction. But then we regulated, we legalized, we commercialized, and now we celebrate it. It's just that there's drugs, and then there's drugs, and there's drugs that we accept, and the drugs that we don't. And any move to criminalize has never really produced the outcomes that we have wanted. The drug law, the drug law movement has never produced what we want, and the only means really of tackling this, which those working within the addiction sphere, for example, have been trying to shout about from the rooftops from the beginning, has been to consider addiction and drug use not from this very biological model of addiction to a drug, but from the greater biopsychosocial needs of the individual and what that means. And that if you improve their livelihood in general, if you improve healthcare, welfare, education, access to social services, and improve their lives all round, then you have a far greater means of tackling things like criminal activity, and particularly drug use, than you would by saying, no, has never worked.
And what I'm hearing is, crime will find a way. If people want to buy something, they'll find a way to do it, whether it's on a digital currency, a cryptocurrency, or cash. We've had a question come through, but we're already out of time, so I'm very sorry, Robert M., we're not going to be able to get to your question. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you very much to Dr. Prash and David Tennant for your wonderful feedback and wonderful thoughts. For those at home, don't forget to subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversation events. There's also a link in the video description to a survey, which will also be sent out to any ticket holders who are present here today. And the City of Melbourne would really love to hear your thoughts on the event, so please take a few minutes and respond. Thanks again for joining us, everyone, here at the Meat Market. It's been lovely to see faces in the world, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation.